Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground."
Those three verses in the first chapter of the Bible, the first chapter of Genesis, have so many truths that are part of the larger story of the Bible. You really can't understand the rest of the Bible, in fact, if you don't understand these three verses. And we could almost do an entire sermon series on these three verses. And we're not going to. We're doing a sermon series on Genesis. But there's a lot of stuff to be said. You'll notice in your worship folder that it says the title of my sermon was going to be "What Makes Your Life Worth It?" But I changed my mind around Thursday. I'm almost like a Pentecostal preacher, God spoke to me or something. I changed my mind around Thursday, and I've titled it instead, "What Makes Others Worth It?" Now, I realize that's not near as felt needy as what makes your life worth it. But the thing is that one of the reasons why I decided to do this, I heard on the news, I read in the news, heard on the news this week that there was a court decision in England. And the court decision is not a big deal to me at all. It just sort of sparked a thought where the judge said that the sexual ethics that the Bible teaches are incompatible with human dignity. And I started thinking, and that's interesting, that now the Bible is seen, and the sexual ethics the Bible teaches are seen as incompatible with human dignity. It's an interesting claim. I don't know if it's historically true or not, but it's an incredibly interesting claim, and it got me thinking, what really is, why did the idea of human dignity, the idea of human rights, where did that come from? Why is it something that we talk about? Because historically it's not been the case. Historically, most cultures throughout the world, and certainly most cultures throughout history, human rights, what? Human rights was not something, and human dignity was not something that the law of the land would have been all that concerned about. Where did it come from? Well, maybe some people might say, it came from the writings of Greek philosophers. It came from the laws of the Roman Empire, and perhaps. But if you read the ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, if you look at the ancient Greek laws and the ancient Roman laws, I think you'd be shocked by the cruelty and the disdain that Plato, for example, and Aristotle and Greek and Roman laws and philosophers were toward the cultural outsiders in their day. The cultural outsiders in their day were the sick, the weak. The cultural outsiders in their day were women, children, infants, the elderly, the poor, other ethnicities. In fact, you can find where Aristotle is actually talking, for example, justifying enslaving other ethnicities, having ethnic slavery be something they have in Greece, because in his mind, the other ethnicities didn't have the intellectual capacity for higher reasoning needed for self-governing. So we were doing them a favor, he says. If we enslave lesser ethnicities, we're actually helping them out because they're incapable intellectually of governing themselves. Also in the Greco-Roman world, they took the elderly, they took the sick, they took the poor that were weak, and they took undesired infants, especially girls, and the way they would simply get rid of them is they would leave them out for exposure in the cold. Or they would leave them out for being taken by wild animals and eaten. So they wouldn't actually kill them per se. They would just put them in a vulnerable situation where they know they would be killed. And this was completely legal. It happened all the time. You see references to it all the time. It was very normal in their culture to dispose of the outsider that way. The earliest known Roman legal code actually permitted a father to decide if he wanted to kill his infant daughter or kill his deformed or weak male son. There's a letter I read of this time from a husband, a father husband, and he's writing to his wife. They found it, and it's kind of interesting. This husband's name's Hilarion, and he's writing to his wife, Elise, and he says this. He says, "Know that I am still in Alexandria." That's a major city, intellectual city in northern Africa or northern Egypt at the time. "I ask and beg of you to take good care of our baby son. As soon as I receive payment, I shall send it to you. If you are delivered of child, if it is a boy, keep it. If a girl, discard it. You have sent me word, don't forget me. How can I forget you? I beg you not to worry." Now, if you look at that right there, very normal, on the one hand, look, don't worry, I love you, don't worry, I'm committed to you. I love our son, make sure you take care of our son. If you have a baby, if it's a son, keep it. If it's a daughter, kill it. It's a weird kind of juxtaposition between, on the one hand, compassion, on the other hand, this sort of cruel brutality toward the undesirable. I think it would be a stretch, an historical stretch at least, to say that the idea of human dignity, the idea of human equality, the idea of human rights existed much in the Greco-Roman world. They had lots of people they considered outsiders, and they treated them horribly and often just had them killed. So let me ask a question again. Where do you think the idea of human dignity, the idea of human rights, the idea of human equality came from? Historically, how did it appear on the scene? Well, I've read many history books on this. It's very well documented. Where it came from was the teachings of Jesus. Where it came from was that Jesus taught and he lived out the truth of Genesis 1, 26 and 27 toward the cultural outsider. That's what made him so controversial. He valued women, which was very controversial in his day, and he got rebuked for it several times by the religious leaders in his culture. He loved children. And it was awkward for him sometimes because people couldn't understand why he was being so visibly and publicly loving in the sense of just valuing children. He honored the poor. He reached out and cared for the weak. It was stunning how countercultural Jesus was toward the typical cultural outsider. And this was the essence of his teaching. And it was the global spread of his followers after he died and rose from the dead. Slowly over years, it was the global spread of those who followed his teachings that spread the notions of human dignity of anybody and everybody because they're created in the image of God. It was the followers of Jesus that spread the notions of human equality and human rights that were put into the laws of justice all around the world. Not quick, but eventually. Sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but eventually. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm definitely not saying that all professing, confessing Christians have been champions of human dignity, champions of human rights throughout history or to the present. I'm not saying that at all. Many have not been. Many are not. Many were oppressors. Many were abusers, just like anybody else. But history has rejected them as nothing but hypocrites because they didn't follow the teachings of Jesus. Not because they did follow, but because they didn't follow the teachings of Jesus that they professed. It wasn't the teachings of Jesus. It was just their own selfish human sin that kind of makes them one of all of us, just like anybody else in history. But every belief system has its own cultural outsiders, and every belief system has its own cultural insiders. The question is not whether or not your belief system has cultural outsiders. Everyone does. The question is, how does your belief system compel you to see, compel you to treat the outsider? If you follow the teachings of if you follow the principles of your belief system, how does that compel you to see and to treat the outsider? Now let's take another belief system. Today in our culture, a growing belief system is scientific naturalism. I'm not talking about science, I'm talking about the ism, the scientism. The scientific naturalism says everything is atoms, everything is matter. The universe is only matter, human beings are only matter, the world is only material, just atoms. Not a spiritual world, not a soul, not any kind of life after death. It's all just material, it's all just atoms. Now, science by itself can tell us absolutely nothing about love, because those aren't atoms. Can tell us absolutely nothing about justice or human dignity or human rights. These are not material things. They're not atoms. And so science doesn't really have a whole lot to offer. Now, they may talk about these things, but they don't talk about them in the discipline of their science. They just simply talk about them because that human beings can't not talk about these things. But scientific naturalism really, by definition, doesn't really have a place for human dignity, for human equality, for human rights, love, justice. Because those aren't atoms. They're not material. They're something else. They're soulish. They're non-material. This is how scientific naturalist Richard Dawkins talks about it in his book, The God Delusion. Here's what he says. He says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He says that's what the universe is, because all the universe is material. All the universe are atoms, is atoms. You kind of have to believe that, even though it doesn't seem like something you want to believe. You kind of have to believe that if you're a scientific naturalist. Now maybe he's right. Maybe the universe really is just an accidental machine of atoms, and it just sort of has just done this on its own without purpose, without design. It's just a universe of atoms. It's completely indifferent to good or evil, because there is no such thing as good or evil in just a universe of atoms. It just is. There's no ought, there's no should, there just is. And maybe that's all the universe is, and maybe that's all you are. If scientific naturalism is true, that is all you are. But I've never really known a scientific naturalist who lives consistently inside that kind of worldview. Because they talk about ought, they talk about should, they talk about justice, they talk about human dignity, they talk about human rights. They're very passionate about it, in fact. But does that come from their scientific naturalism, or is it coming from something else? And I think what's happened today, we're kind of in a transition. Today's scientific naturalist has the benefit right now of living off of a kind of borrowed credit card of the Christian belief system that still kind of echoes in our culture. Even as it rejects that belief system, rather than having to live consistently within everything that would be true if scientific naturalism were real, those implications are hard. Those implications are really hard to be, because we don't think there's not evil. We think there's evil. We don't think there's not good. We think there's good. We don't think there's not justice. We think there's justice. We don't think the universe is blind and pitifully indifferent. We think it matters. People even talk about the universe is trying to tell me something. The universe wants us to get together. The universe is this and that. No, it's blind, pitiful indifference. According to Richard Dawkins, and he's right, if he's right. Now, I wonder, after the credit card gets spent, and the echoes of the Christian belief system begin to be more and more faint. And if scientific naturalism becomes a belief system that becomes much more dominant than it is today, I wonder how will scientific naturalism treat its outsiders 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if they don't believe there's any evil, any good, just blind, pitiless indifference. It's far too easy in any belief system for the circle of human dignity, the circle of human rights to get smaller and smaller as that belief system becomes more and more tribal in its thinking. The New York Times did an article on somebody talking about how our politics is becoming more and more tribal. I don't know if you've noticed, but the politics that we have now has become more us versus them than it used to be. And it's causing people to see the other, to see the outsider quite differently than perhaps we have a generation ago. And they showed this by asking a series of questions to both Republicans and Democrats. Not that that's the only political parties in town, but those are the predominant ones. And they were surprised at how each camp is so tribal in their thinking that they actually see the other as less and less human. So, for example, they asked Republicans and Democrats whether they agreed with the statement that the opposite party are downright evil. And 42% agreed. Yeah, the other side, the other party, they're downright evil. They also found that nearly 20%, Republicans and Democrats, agree with the statement that their political adversaries, quote, lack the traits to be considered fully human. 20% agreed with that. They're not fully human, the other side. They asked, do you ever think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died? Would we be better off as a country if large numbers of those people, of them, the outsider, just died? 18% said yeah. I'm sorry, I was wrong. 20% said yeah. Now you might think, well, that's encouraging. 80% don't want the other side to die. Okay, yeah, positive, let's be positive. But 20% is more than 20 million people in this country that want the other political party to have large numbers die because they think the country would be better off. Does that belief system see and treat the outsider with human dignity, human rights? They asked another question. What if the opposing party won the presidential election in 2020? They asked, how much do you feel violence would be justified then? 18%, that's the 18%. So 2% less, which is encouraging. 18% said, yeah, I think violence would be justified if they win the election. Every belief system has cultural insiders and outsiders. Every belief system does. The question is, how does your belief system compel you to compel you to see the outsider? This is where Genesis 1:26 and 27 is unlike anything else. It's unlike any other belief system in this foundation. Let's read it again, verse 26. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Now, up until now in Genesis 1, you've got, and God said, let there be, and there was. And God said, let there be, and there was. And God said, let it be, and it was. But now all of a sudden he's saying, let us. This becomes personal, first person, and it's plural. That's weird, right? God is saying, let us, and the question is, why? Who's he talking to? There's no humans left. He's talking about making humans. So who's he talking to? And some have said, and I've said in the past, that this is probably some early cryptic biblical foreshadowing of the Trinity. But I don't think that's how the first readers of Genesis would have read it. I think the way the first readers of Genesis would have read it is consistent with a lot of other places in the Bible that actually teach it. And that is, God is talking to angelic beings who he allows to participate with him in overseeing his creation. You see this clearly in the book of Revelation at the end of the New Testament. There are angelic beings that oversee aspects of God's creation that God uses to accomplish his will. He gives them the freedom to participate in God's universe. And at this point in the story of the earth, God is involving these angelic beings in let us make man in our image, which means that these angelic beings are also made in the image of God. And God is involving them in the process. But now the next verse says that they didn't do the creating, God did the creating. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. But that man and that him is a little different than just the male we think of, because it says male and female, he created them. Male and female alike together equally share the status of being made in God's image. And that was a radical teaching, concept, view back then when that was written. The words image, the words likeness, image appear 4 times in these 2 verses. This is the point of the whole passage. This is the point. The Bible says human beings are different than any other belief system would say, because we are actually not just created by God, we are created like God. We are his image, his likeness. In the time this was written, what that meant was an image was when a king in the ancient Near East would put statues of himself all throughout his empire to project his rule, project his presence. This is my rule. And those statues, those images served as representatives to project his kingship. And God is saying, well, you're not a statue, and it's different than that, but I am making human beings to project my character, to project my glory, project my love, project my rule over all creation on earth. And so Genesis, the whole point here, look at verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that. Here's why they're in our image. Here's why they're in our likeness. It's so that they can rule over all creation on the earth. Human beings, both men and women equally, were created with a unique ability and the unique purpose to be God's projected images on the earth. Special representatives that would continue his work of creation. Special representatives that would rule over his work of creation. Now, no doubt, very quick in the book of Genesis, everything goes south. As the story of Genesis unfolds, this image will become marred. This image will become deformed. This image will become misshapen as humans sin and rebel against God. They can't really project the rule of God if they don't submit to the rule of God. They can't project the love of God if they're not submitting to the love of God, the glory of God if they're rejecting the glory of God, but they're still created in his image. The book of Genesis clearly says that in chapter 9. It's just a deformed image. The image of God in humanity will be used now instead to rule selfishly and to oppress the outsider and to abuse animals and to abuse the earth, rather than represent God's love and care. But we still have the image of God, which is why we're trying to save beach whales, which is why we care about animals in ways that start all kinds of organizations to protect them, rescue them. These are all things we can't help doing because we're created in the image of God. But when it comes to any verse in the Bible, especially right here in the beginning of the Bible, the rest of the Bible provides important context for us to understand. And as the rest of the Bible unfolds, we discover that even though we have rebelled against God and the image of God has been marred and it seems like the whole plan has been ruined, it hasn't. We discover that God himself is born into the rebellious human race in the person of Jesus as the fully restored image of God in humanity. He was a human. He was raised a human. He still is a human. He will return a human. He is the fully restored image of God in humanity. The Bible says that Jesus came not just to forgive sins. I mean, that's part of what's necessary to accomplish why he came, but he didn't come just to forgive sins. The reason why Jesus came was to restore humanity to all of what it means to be in the image of God. That's why these verses in the first chapter of the Bible really are the thesis statement of the rest of the Bible, because God is still going to accomplish the whole thing and every bit as much as he intended when he said, "Let us make man in our image." Through Jesus, through his death, through his resurrection, his followers will be fully restored to the glory of the image of God on a restored earth forever. This is what salvation means when you read that word in the Bible. Salvation doesn't mean, it's never meant, it doesn't mean, it never has meant, salvation means that when you die, you go to heaven. You don't see that teaching anywhere in the Bible. It's never been part of the gospel. It's never been the definition of salvation. It's not why Jesus came. It's not God's mission for you. In the Bible, salvation is resurrection. In the Bible, salvation is being restored to the image of God by a resurrection like Jesus' resurrection on a restored earth. Just one example is in Romans chapter 8. The Apostle Paul says in verse 18, "I consider that our being those who follow Jesus, who have faith in him, want him as king, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." This image revealed, this glory restored, revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation. It's going to be renewed. For the children, that's a synonym in the Bible of those who have the image of God, for the children of God to be revealed. That's a future event. We're going to be fully restored to the glory of the full image of God. That's what it means to be a child of God. He goes on to say in verse 29, "For those God foreknew," in other words, God is God. He knows about all this before you were even born. "Those he foreknew, he also predestined." In other words, he's decided beforehand this is going to happen. Drew a circle around you. I'm going to restore you. He predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's the perfect image of God, that we might be the firstborn, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. His resurrection is the first of many more to come. "And those he predestined," in other words, decided beforehand, "he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified," in other words, those he's going to make righteous, he also glorified. All this is past tense, but it's talking about a future thing, right? To be glorified is a resurrection in the future, but it's past tense to Paul because God's the subject of the verb. It's just as good as done. So here's the thing you got to get. I'm done with teaching all that. Let me just say what it means. Because of Jesus, every human being has this potential: being restored to the glory of the image of God. Every human being has this potential. I don't care what they believe right now because the story's not done yet. We don't know what they're going to believe. I had a guy years ago that was a friend of mine, and we used to always argue about his atheism, my Christianity. He read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. He had all kinds of ammo to use against me. We had intense discussions. And then a few years later, I'm standing back there in the back. Sometimes you see me standing back there, and I see my friend walking in. I go, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "Yeah, I've been coming for like the last month." I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I started listening online. I thought I might as well attend." And then he started attending. He goes, "I kind of like this." And now he goes, "Now I can't miss it. I love it. I love being here. I love the teaching. I love the music." You have no idea the end of the story of people, what they believe now. You just don't. Trust me, you don't. So because of Jesus, every human being has this potential of glory, regardless of their beliefs now. And Genesis 1:26 and 27 means, but even now they have the image of God. Even now they have this likeness of God. It means that there is a rock-solid, objective, irreducible glory and significance and dignity and value and worth to every human being, whether they're insiders or whether they're outsiders. It means that every person that comes across our path, the image of God in them now and the potential future restored fully image of God in the future, glory thing, it means that we must treat every human being that comes across our path with a kind of sacredness because they're the image of God, a kind of reverence, a kind of respect, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their behavior, whether they're insiders or outsiders or whatever siders they are. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book, The Weight of Glory. And, we've looked at this before, but this is a really good time to look at it again and think about it again. I love thinking about it often. He says this, it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. He's talking about the future glory, being fully restored to the image of God. Or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare, one or the other. We're kind of heading somewhere, one or the other. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. Sobering thought. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another. All friendships, all loves, all play, all politics, all social media. Wait, no, he didn't say that. There are no ordinary people. Catch this. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, that just means communion, the bread and the wine, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Now just think about that. Genesis 1:26-27 should make us far-reaching, more than any other belief system, far-reaching in how we see and how we treat outsiders and insiders. Insiders and outsiders. I want to look at one more verse. We're done. As the music team comes back, I'm just going to go ahead and invite them out here. One more verse in the New Testament that has Genesis 1:26 and 27 in mind when James writes this in 3:9. He says, with the tongue we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. How can you curse? How can you slander? How can you speak against? How can you belittle? How can you treat so cruelly or just so disrespectfully or just blow off or just snub somebody who is the very likeness of God, James says? Aren't you thinking like a Christian? Aren't you thinking like somebody who believes? Genesis 1:27, 26? How can you do that? How can you curse somebody who's made in God's likeness? My brothers and sisters, he says, this should not be. We should not, we Christians, this is our belief system, we should not join in to the tribal slander in our politics. Everybody else might be doing it, but they might have a different belief system. Ours, it makes us far-reaching in a whole different direction. We should not be doing the same selfish disrespect toward our spouse, our husband, our wife. Our selfish impatience. Are just easily being irritated towards somebody that is created in the image of God, and that if you saw now what they're going to be like in the future, you'd be tempted to worship them, not disrespect them, not blow them off, not belittle them. People we work with, people we're in conflict with, people we live alongside. Try it this week. Just think about it. Think just this week. Give yourself a week to really focus. Think about this. When you look at people, anybody, whether they're outsiders, people who irritate you, people who oppose you, people who are on the other side politically than you, just think to yourself. Or people who are the insiders, your wife, your husband, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your friends, your roommates, your insider coworkers, and your outsider kind of coworkers. People that you too often take for granted, that irritate you because you take them for granted. Think about this. See them through the image of the glory of God, because there are no ordinary people. Not with Genesis 1:26 and 27 being true. There are no ordinary people. Not with Romans 8 being true. You've never talked to a mere mortal. It's with immortal people that you get mad at, that you marry, that you play with, that you argue with. Walk alongside. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, there is the people around you. They are the holiest object presented to your senses. Think about that this week. Amen.